In Connecticut, in the year 1800, a man named John Brown was born. Although aspiring to be a preacher in his early life, in his 20s he got married, had many children, and established a respectable leather tanning business on a 200-acre plot of land which included a full cattle farm. Things would take a gloomy turn for him in the next decade when his wife and 2 of his children died within just a few years. He did remarry, and he moved his tanning business to Ohio. However, he was seriously affected by the economic crisis of 1839, even going to jail at one point for illegally occupying land which had been confiscated from him due to inability to repay loans. His first radical abolitionist sentiment came in 1837 after the death of Elijah P. Lovejoy, an abolitionist minister who was murdered by a pro-slavery mob. After hearing about it, John vowed he would consecrate his life to the destruction of slavery. And boy, he did. In 1842, he was declared bankrupt. In 1843, 4 of his children died of dysentery. During this time, he had taken to selling sheep wool. In 1846, he and a business partner, Simon Perkins, moved together up to the radically abolitionist town of Springfield, Massachusetts. There, he became a member of St. John's Abolitionist Church, one of the most recognized abolitionist places in America at the time. In the late 1840s, he had opportunities to speak with those such as Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass through this church. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act passed, mandating that authorities in free states assist in the return of escaped slaves to their masters, and imposing punishments on those who help slaves escape. After this law, Brown organized a few people and formed the League of Gileadites, the name being a reference to Mount Gilead from the Bible. Brown instructed his militant group to act quickly, quietly, and efficiently in assisting any escaped slaves who found their way to Springfield. Since the founding of this group, not one escaped slave who came to Springfield was ever returned to their master. In 1855, Brown hears from a relative in Kansas Territory that anti-slavery groups there are completely unprepared for violence which would be brought in by pro-slavery demonstrators during the vote that would soon happen deciding whether their new state would be slave or free. He then wasted no time in gathering funds and weapons from financial backers as he made his way south and west. Some background on the situation at Kansas at the time: the land was not yet a state. A vote was being planned in which the residents of Kansas would decide if it was to be a free state or a slave state when it does enter the Union. As a result, thousands from out of state were going into Kansas in order to vote for their own hyper-partisan faction. Mixed with the low amount of law enforcement in a Wild West-type atmosphere, this situation was about to turn volatile. Brown's own motivations were made up of anger at pro-slavery forces over numerous examples of violence that he saw, including Elijah P. Lovejoy, as well as disgust at anti-slavery partisans, who he saw as being weak and cowardly for not responding with violence of their own. John Brown's first entry into the events that would be known as Bloody Kansas was a skirmish between pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists called the Battle of Black Jack. In the battle, Brown and 29 others ambushed a group of pro-slavery people led by Henry C. Pate. That was the same group who had earlier kidnapped 2 of Brown's sons. Brown was able to take Pate and 22 others prisoner, and negotiated the release of his sons before he set them free. Brown's Kansas campaign continued when, in August, a group of 300 Missourians crossed into Kansas intending to destroy Free State settlements there. Brown and a group of 38 abolitionists waited for them in a defended location and tried to stop them. They managed to kill around 20 and wound around 40 slavery fighters before being forced to retreat. Yes, 38 people stood up against 300 people. This battle got Brown into the national spotlight. Into September, Brown and his group started organizing with leaders of Free State settlements, planning to defend their ground from a group of 2,700 who were expected to invade from Missouri. It was then that the new governor, John W. Geary of Kansas, ordered both sides to disarm and disband, offering leniency to former fighters. Brown and his sons took advantage of this and went back north. Over the next few years, he would collect money and guns while developing a secret plan to go into Virginia and do quote-unquote Kansas work. In Chatham, Ontario, in early 1858, a meeting was held which included Brown, Harriet Tubman, and many of the people who worked for or were saved by the Underground Railroad. A constitution for the land that Brown was to liberate was written, and an acting president, Secretary of State, and Secretary of War were chosen. In December and January of 58 and 59, Brown led a raid from Kansas into Missouri, successfully freeing 11 slaves and taking them to Detroit, arranging a ferry for them into Canada. He spent the next few months in New England once again, raising money for his next and last mission. This mission would take him down to Maryland and Northern Virginia, where he and Harriet Tubman planned to take over a piece of land to be a new state, a state for freed slaves. They believed that after they started fighting, slaves from across the South would rise up, overthrow their masters, and go to join Brown's army. Tubman would go to Ontario before the first battle and look to recruit more fighters from among those freed by the Underground Railroad. Far fewer would come down than Brown was expecting. Meanwhile, Frederick Douglass, who disagreed with Brown's methods, had been discouraging all free blacks from joining. When they were ready to start, Brown had only 21 fighters as opposed to the 4,500 he was hoping for. He went ahead anyway. His plan was to start in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, raiding the armory for its 100,000 rifles. They planned to give these rifles to local slaves, helping them escape from their masters and join their army. They would then travel throughout Virginia and then throughout the South, freeing every slave they could as they went. They started by cutting the telegraph lines in the town and taking over the armory from the single watchman who was guarding it. Things started to go badly, though, when a normal passenger train came through town. After some confusion and fighting, and the shooting of a free black man aboard the train made it out of Harper's Ferry and went on to warn Baltimore. In the meantime, locals had taken up arms and started shooting at Brown's men, trapping them inside the armory. The shootout continued throughout the day, and by the next day, the United States Marines, under command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, had the building surrounded. They approached under a white flag and offered peace to Brown's fighters. They refused. Minutes later, American forces had broken down the door and stormed the building, taking Brown and all the survivors into custody. Brown was later tried for 4 counts of murder, conspiracy to stage a rebellion, and treason against the state of Virginia. He was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. He was killed on December 2nd of 1859. On the morning of his execution, he wrote the following: "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done."